G'day mate, 40 here. Now, like you, I have situations where I am excellent and morally strong and outstanding and have unique gifts. Then there are other situations where I'm mediocre, morally weak, suspect, right, prone to all the frailties of the human condition. So, understandably, like you, I would prefer to place myself in situations where I'm going to excel and minimize situations where I'm much more likely to fail, make a fool of myself, struggle, be highly uncomfortable, awkward, low status. But then there's a moral conundrum here. What if placing myself in situations where I'm superb is bad for other people? For example, I could host a live stream and have a bunch of people come on the show and say outrageous things that are incredibly entertaining, sometimes piercingly honest and vulnerable. But by hosting such a show, it would ruin the lives of many of the participants who are not adequately disciplined in the things that they reveal publicly. So my interests would be aligned with hosting a show where people would say captivating, compelling, original, vulnerable, honest things. And hey, it's not my fault if they choose to self-destruct publicly. I'm just providing a forum, right? I'm just a bloke having a conversation on YouTube, right? What they say on my live stream, that's not my responsibility. They're adults and they can make their own decisions. So I think we often have situations where it's really good for us, but it's really bad for other people. Thinking about the movie The History Boys, there's also a play, or I think there was a movie, LIE, Long Island Expressway, and both The History Boys and LIE were about an adult who was in many ways admirable, but was also a bit of a molester. And so people don't tend to be all good and all bad. Right? People tend to be good in some situations, bad in other situations. And I had a mentor and a friend at UCLA. It was just an upstanding gentleman, Jules Zentner. He was the UCLA mentor, but there was an official title for that. He was the advisor for pre-med and pre-law students. And he would also live in the UCLA dormitories. And just a wonderful mentor. He was a good friend to me after chronic fatigue syndrome forced me to leave UCLA. And he would write me letters, and we'd have these deep conversations via the mail, and his kindness was inspiring to me. It just kept me going through some of the darkest years of my life. When I managed to regain my health at age 27, he said I could come stay with him. He lived downstairs in one of the UCLA dormitories. And so about 2 weeks into my stay with him in April of 1994, I told him about my hot and heavy date that night, and then I went to bed. Then he came padding into my room and asked me if I'd like a blowjob. And I said no, thank you, and I just turned away from him. And our friendship was never the same after that. And so I have to assume that I was not the only person that he mentored that he also got into sexual relationships with. So, g'day mates, you are looking live at Olympic Boulevard and Bedford. Right, we are on the corner of Beverly Hills, California. So he was a wonderful mentor, he was a demanding professor, he was an expert in Scandinavian studies. And so he got into this field, I think, in the early 1960s or 1950s, Mid-1950s, because he thought that it was going to be incredibly important field, that the Cold War might play out in Scandinavia. So he had thought about developing an expertise in China, which was a very tiny economy at the time of the 1950s, but instead he chose Scandinavia. But he would forever regret that, because if he'd become an expert in China, then his skills would be in much more demand. He'd have more prestige, more opportunities in life, he'd have more income, and he'd have not just more financial and scholarly opportunities, but along with more wealth, more status, more academic opportunities, he'd also have more sexual opportunities. So a major reason that many men work particularly hard is that they want more sexual opportunities. So a lot of hard pro-social labor is done for selfish sexual self-aggrandizement reasons. And so thinking about the situation in Syria right now, let's say that you're an expert in Syria and you devoted your life to studying Syria and learning the languages and the cultures of the people who lived in Syria, and you've had to live a life of tremendous discipline. So in your 20s, when other people were out partying, right, you were studying hard and moving ahead in your profession. You're getting a PhD. You're undergoing a degree of stress that other people could not comprehend. And you finally achieve a position of respect in academia. And then, right, you have a situation like now, and you're interviewed on Fox News and CNN, and maybe you have people in the State Department who are calling you to ask your opinion about what's going on. So if you then say the United States has no vital interest about what's going on in Syria, right, you are going to have a lot less status, prestige, opportunity. On the other hand, the more you hype the importance of what's going on in Syria, right, the more you make the case that there are compelling, dramatic reasons why the United States should care about these developments in Syria and the flight of Assad and the takeover of Syria by a group formerly associated with ISIS. Right? The more dramatic and compelling you make the case for paying attention to what's going on in Syria, the better that is for you personally. It expands your professional opportunities, your financial opportunities, your networking opportunities, your status opportunities, and even your sexual opportunities. So, while the bare truth, the bare naked truth might be the United States has no vital national interests at stake in Syria, right? If you say that truth, then you don't get status, you don't increase your professional and financial and personal opportunities, right? That attitude is really bad for you personally. So if you align your comments with what is true, if you optimize for truth, that's bad for your career. That's bad for your status. That's bad for your funding. Right? That's bad for your opportunities to be on TV. And so when you watch the news coverage about what's going on in Syria, and there are all these national security experts right now speaking out about the situation in Syria on CNN, and MSNBC, and Fox News, right, they're all saying how dramatic and important and how vital the situation is in Syria for American interests. And what are the vital national interests that America has right now in Syria? Well, it's the human rights of the Syrian people. We have US-backed Kurds operating camps for family members of ISIS. And if the US doesn't stay involved in Syria, and the US doesn't keep troops in Syria, if the US isn't deeply intervening in Syria, well then, my God, we might have an Islamist regime that limits the rights of women to get an education and the rights of gays to get married and the rights of Christians to openly practice their religion. And truly, it's a vital national security interest for America to promote freedom and democracy and liberal humanitarian values. And so the game is rigged so that the people who are all speaking out about Syria right now in the media are people who are strongly incentivized to make a compelling case for how important the events in Syria are. Right? You don't get to increase your ego and your status and your self-conception and your income by saying it doesn't really matter for American interests what's happening in Syria right now. Right? All the incentives aligned for you to exaggerate and to paint a compelling picture of how important the situation in Syria is for American interests. So all the incentives are to not tell the truth. Right? There are no think tanks, to the best of my knowledge, with any resources promoting an isolationist worldview. Right? Which well-funded think tanks have scholars promoting an isolationist worldview? Which well-funded think tanks promote a MAGA, Make America Great Again worldview? Right? Not many, if any. So you're an intellectual, you're a scholar, you want to devote your life to the study of the Middle East, right? Then you have to hype the importance of the Middle East to American interests, even if it's not true. Right? You have to operate against truth to further your own interests. I think we all have these type of situations where we're strongly incentivized to operate against truth to preserve our own interests. Right? If we're an employee, usually there are going to be all sorts of situations where we have to tell lies to keep our job. And what does that do to our soul? To be consistently telling lies to further our own financial and social interests. So in 1976, Jimmy Carter, an evangelical Christian, he had the support of most evangelical Christian voters in the 1976 election. But then by 1980, evangelical Christians had swung solidly behind Ronald Reagan. And one of the key members of the evangelical Christian community was Jerry Falwell, who in 1976 had supported Jimmy Carter until Jimmy Carter did an interview with Playboy magazine. And Jerry Falwell stated publicly that it was inappropriate for Jimmy Carter to appear in Playboy magazine next to nude centerfolds. And someone from the Carter campaign called Jerry Falwell and rebuked him. Like, how dare you criticize Jimmy Carter? We're all in it together. Jimmy's a fellow evangelical Christian like you. And Jerry Falwell did not take rebuke well. Most people don't enjoy being rebuked, right? Most people are not going to respond positively to rebuke. So there are often religious admonitions in various religious traditions about making the case for rebuking the sinner in your community, but it doesn't usually work out well for the person who carries that out. And so Jerry Falwell was incensed at being rebuked, and he then sided up the moral majority and went to bat for Republicans and in general and Ronald Reagan in particular. So you wonder how much did that rebuke from a member of the Jimmy Carter team swing Jerry Falwell's proclivities against Jimmy Carter and the Democrats. So the Joe Biden administration put on an event at the White House promoting the use of electrical vehicles, but they didn't invite Elon Musk. And Elon Musk took the snub very personally. He reacted intensely, and he ended up spending tens of millions of dollars promoting Donald Trump, throwing his support behind Donald Trump. And so how much of that was related to the snub that the Biden administration had delivered to Donald Trump. And I think around 2014, there was a White House Press Association dinner where Barack Obama made a series of jokes at the expense of Donald Trump, just kept mocking him. And Donald Trump didn't take that too well. So how much did that add fuel to Donald Trump's drive to win the presidency? So often the big doors swing on small hinges. And so I was listening to CNN this morning. There were these commentators talking about the vital national security interests at stake in Syria. And I just don't see it. And they talked about there's a void. There's a void right now in Syria that if America doesn't fill that void, someone else will. And so the CNN host and the CNN national security expert and the CNN Syria experts are all talking about this void that America needs to fill to make sure that Syria doesn't become an Islamist regime. Well, guess what? There are lots of voids around me that I should not be filling. There are many chasms and cavities in life that we should not be filling. And noting that there's a void in Syria does not imply that America should be filling that void. There are voids and chasms and holes all around the world that America could be filling, but it's not in America's interest to do so. Right? If someone's got a hole in their soul, it's not up to me to try to fill that hole. If Syria has a void, it's not in America's vital national security interest to fill that void. Right? Someone who's broken, got a hole in their soul, and they attach to you because you make them feel alive. You make them feel whole. That's not going to last. Right? We can't borrow functioning from other people for very long. Eventually we become a drag on them, and they will feel compelled to set limits on us and to even cut us loose. So the Sunni Muslim Arab world is not strongly nationalist. Syria does not call up, does not arouse strong nationalist sympathies, because Syria, Jordan, Iraq, these Sunni Arab states, right? These are all artificial creations by the West. So loyalties in the Sunni and Shia world overwhelmingly tend to be tribal, not nationalist. Can't imagine that many Syrians are eager to sacrifice themselves on behalf of this abstract entity called Syria. So the stronger you have family and tribal ties, right, the more difficult it is to command national ties. So nationalism first developed in England because people from Northern Europe tended to have less inbreeding. There was less cousin marriage. Right? Family ties were weaker. People in England and Northern Europe were more individualist. And so it was easier for them to develop a loyalty to the nation state that would effectively supersede tendencies towards familism, where the only people you trusted were members of your family and extended family. So tightly inbred communities do not naturally incline towards the building of nation states. They don't naturally incline towards nationalism. So in England and in Northern Europe, you had these imagined communities where people who are righteous, right, who are decent, right, that's where you would give your loyalty, not necessarily to people that you were related to. And so they developed this universalist notion of right and wrong. So there was no longer just a moral code for how you treat members of your in-group and a much more relaxed moral code for how you treat members of your out-group, but there was one universal moral code that you lived up to, and most of the world's not that way. And so when you have a group with universal moral code and it imports or allows into its high-functioning community all sorts of people with a dual moral code, where there's one standard for how you treat members of your in-group and a much more relaxed standard for how you treat members of your out-group, right? That is going to dissolve social trust and social cohesion. Are you watching TV and following the news about what's going on in Syria? And whenever I read or hear commentators talking about how vitally important Syria is to the United States and how the United States needs to make sure that Syria doesn't turn into an Islamist state, I always get the sense that these commentators are speaking out of their own personal self-interest to create a feeling of excitement and meaning and purpose for themselves. They're promoting a self-interest that's not aligned with what is true, not aligned with what's in America's best interest. So imagine the type of person who devotes himself to American foreign policy. Right? The more that America intervenes, right, the more important that person can feel. And just imagine how exciting it is to play the great game of foreign policy and intervening all over the world. That's I guess the adrenaline flowing. It's very exciting. It makes you important. Right, you are changing the world. But many things that make you important and that are good for your self-interest, right, are bad for other people. And you have to sell your soul if you rely on inflating your self-interest by promoting things that are not true. So you get to skip many of these moral dilemmas simply by optimizing for truth rather than self-aggrandizement.